Eric, are you sitting here? Sit there. Just in case. That's the microphone. You can shift that out of the bloody road.
Well, good evening, gentlemen. Welcome along tonight to January's meeting, which is a presentation by two well-known members of the club, Mr. Iain Quinn and Mr. Eric Schofield, who are going to tell us about 5 decades of the King George V. So without any more delays, I'll hand you over to Iain and Eric. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody, and a warm welcome, a happy new year to you all, and those listening online as well when they see it. A warm welcome to this 5 decades of the King George V. It's hard to believe, folks, that it's now a century since a ship that sat so comfortable in this club, the King George V, now reaches. She might not be there outside this room, but she's certainly around in our memory for those of us who lived the King George V. Now, I was very lucky in having a father who was keen in Clyde steamers, and I wasn't dragged kicking to see them. I was dragged willingly to see them, and I owe a lot to my father Edward for fostering the interest. Even this very day, he does just that, talking the Clyde, and you learn something different from people like that every time they speak to you. The 27th of August, 1925, the order was placed at Denny. Now, there are pictures of the King George getting launched, and there are pictures of the King George full-time in our memories. But I've decided to go down a different path tonight of the subject matter, because I'm a great believer that if something still survives that replicates what you could do, then you should tell that that is the case. No guesses why the Waverley is on the screen for that very purpose, but she's paying her own homage to the Denny shipyard at Dumbarton each and every time she passes by, whether it's morning, afternoon or the evening on our Clyde excursions. So let's turn the clock back to the 27th of August 1925 when the order was placed at Denny. A few months later, the King George was launched, the 29th of April 1926, into what was very clear at that time the national coal strike. It took to the 8th of September of that year before the George settled comfortably on what she was built to do, and that was set out in the Clyde to either Campbellton or Inverary for Williamson. However, there was something novel about this craft, the King George V, that the Clyde had never witnessed before. And that is the all-weather comfort that she brought with her to this fine area that we know as Glasgow and the Clyde coast. She was originally intended to be King George, but to satisfy the Lloyd's Register, the 5 or the V was added to save confusion. The trials of the George went way after her entry to service. Williamson, as the company, were desperate to get the George out, and that they did for the last few weeks of the sailing season. And known to most of us, Donald Robertson, the late Donald Robertson, was just sit by his mother on this occasion on our maiden voyage. He was at Rothesay this day and watched his mother coming off the King George V, and he was absolutely shocked that she'd done so, because she wasn't expected to come off the George. And he pestered his mother so much that she paid his ticket to go on the 9th of September 1926, so that he wasn't outdone by his mother. He said, it was the only time I ever fell out with my mother. He said, she came off the King George V, and he said, what are you doing on there? I'm supposed to be on that first before you. But he got his trip in the end. So the trials of the George went on way into the autumn. Can you imagine now an owner of a ship demanding that his ship is put into service before trials? I think there'd be, well, I'm not going to say it. The following couple of years, the George got herself into a bit of bother, as is well known by the Clyde steamer buffs. She caused a wee bit of a hiatus with her high pressure turbines, and that was the case right up until 1934, when Williamson decided to end it all and go for broke and reboiler it. So I bypassed 1926. I wasn't all that keen on the George when she was new in photographs, the pencil thin funnels, for example. They look not too terrible with the lids on them, but even that, no, I'm not happy. She looks not too desperate here though. This is it's a classic pose, isn't it? Rossi Bay, in that period of life that the George was zooming about as new. I just wonder what Caledonian thought when they saw this, and how it usurped the Glen Sannox of just a year before for the all-weather comfort that the George brought. And the Glen Sannox, it was like the Victorian era all over again, where you were made to stand out in the open regardless of what part of the deck you were on. Down at Campbellton, well, the George and the Queen Alexander were very comfortable with each other. And the George predominantly did Inveraray because her certificate was less than the Campbellton boat. So when it came to busy spells though, like the Glasgow Fair and so on, they switched. The George went to Campbellton and the Queen Alexander went to Inveraray. For that reason, the Queen Alexander could carry more. The day the King Georges met, King George V taking King George V to King George V. Friday, the 10th of July 1931, the opening of the King George V dock. So you'll never look at a picture of the King George V dock again without thinking King George V to King George V with King George V. I wouldn't like to say which one is the king and which one is the queen on there, but I would say to the right of the mast, it looks awful like Queen Mary. The day they all raised the glass to King George V and Queen Mary and all the other Clyde steamers. Moving on to 1935, because our timing has been cut a wee bit by modern technology, of which the George did not sit comfortably with. Even all those years ago, she caused problems. So our own boiler trouble tonight has now been sorted out and we're up and running. So we move on to other incidents of the King George's life. Well, you've heard about the fireman getting killed in 1927. That was pretty common knowledge. There was another one in 1929 when the tube burst. One of our boiler tubes burst off Cattical Bay in Arden in the Kilbrannan Sound. The King George went to Pirn Mill, hove to there and transferred people going to Campbellton to the Devar. And the George, albeit very slow, continued back to Weems Bay where most got off, then on to Dunoon and then Gourock and Greenock, where she remained for a while until she was assessed for further service. The collision with the Jeannie Deans came in 7th of August 1934 off Kilcatton Bay. That's pretty well known as well. And the reboilering came in 1934 with our new funnels for 1935, as you see here. And on April 22nd of that year, 1935, she had a short invited cruise to show off the new funnels and our new boilers. Here she is at Inveraray, dressed over with the Clyde cargo steamer, the Minnard, in the background. The George was now in her final year in Williamson, and she looked the best. And she stuck with this for the best part of 40 years, with the exception of a second mast and red funnels. Williamson were well known for evening cruises. They offered plenty, not just from the common, like Kilcreggan, which was novel for the George, but not for evening cruises. Kilcreggan, Helensburgh, Largs Fair via Craigandorn, Aricher, Lochranza, all featured, and they made much of it. But unlike the Waverley today, where you can generally afford a trip in the Waverley and still have change in your pocket, in 1935 and before, it took up a fair part of your weekly wage, a trip to Campbelltown in the King George V or the Queen Alexandra. If you look at the fares, you'll see why. You would be getting no change from your wage packet, never mind for a day trip in the Waverley. So the like for like, what did they do? They went in the evening cruise instead to the open part of the Firth for a much reduced fare, and that allowed people, enthusiasts and the like of the time, to do trips that they couldn't afford in a better way, on an evening, for example, on the ships they wanted to go on, Donald Robertson included. The 3rd of October 1935, the George became McBrain, and she didn't go on long enough in 35 to complete her season. I've often wondered if that was deliberate. They knew it was coming round the corner, because on the same day the Herald ran the story as the George's final trip was supposed to be. Here she is then at Oban on a Sunday, and more about that from Eric. And that's the reason why I'm not covering over the ground, because it would be unfair in my esteemed colleague to take away from him what is going to be a wee bit of the fun side of the King George that we all knew. There is one thing for sure: when the funnels became red and she settled into Oban on the 5th of June 1936, it was to bring a new hostage to fortune to the Oban area. It was like the Queen Mary appearing in the Clyde, the Queen Mary II, later on. It was totally different from anything else. The Victorian and Edwardian paddle steamers were now forgotten, and they had all-weather comfort to enjoy one of Britain's most exposed excursions. Through the George's career, she changed markedly, and I draw your attention to the club's journals. Go home and reunite yourself with them, because the full story's there, and they're lovely to open and have a read. Robin Boyd's Diamond King, 1986, his history of the King George for the 1970 charters of the King George. Why not go and dig them out and have a look and have a read, or buy them tonight if you haven't got them. The postcards of the day were common now around Oban and Fort William, and the local shops were festooned with these. And this is my own particular favourite one of the King George V in her condition, with the varnished doors, between her arrival in Oban after the war in 1947 until the early 1950s, when they decided to paint them white, and rightly so, with the second mast. The club has had many good photographs published over the years, not just by myself, but by Graham Dunlop and by Douglas Brown before us. And these were the two that I had the negatives for and never had them published, and they've been some of the best sellers that the club has ever had, I would say. They're still available, but that's not to say they're not popular. The King George fitting out after the war at Denny of Dumbarton, and not only does it show you uniquely her in that position, but it shows her birthplace as well to great effect, along with the Loch Seaforth, which allows you to date the photograph, and the Royal Iris fitting out for the Mersey in the background. A.E. Bennett allowed this photograph to be used, and it's in the club's collection, and it's a cracker of the George taken from a rowing boat eye level of these things that really make them look like you've never witnessed. We've all seen them from a pier or a promenade level, but from an overhead point of view or a rowing boat's point of view, drones in that angle just bring a whole different meaning to the whole sense of occasion. I'm not going to say it's my favourite picture of the King George, but it's one of them. Now, I decided to stray from the normal. What does the King George V do today? Well, she does quite a lot, as it happens. For in 2019, John McNulty built a very fine model of the King George V. And just before lockdown, on St Andrew's Day, I suggested to John that we go to Calmac and during that season and have a word with him and see if we could raise funds for the Waverley, which was going through the boiler refit appeal at the time. Could we raise money to help the Waverley with the King George V? The answer came back, yes. But what condition do I build the King George V in? Good question. Does he make it with a name between the two portholes? Or does he build it with the name in front of the porthole? Does he build the George without the forward stairway, as it came in 1960? Or does he build it without? Does he build it without radar or with? And so on and so forth. Well, turning the clock back to a smaller model of the same style, we have Lee McLean's St Columba and the King George V uniquely at Largs. Although the 5 funnels did appear at Rothesay in real life in 1956 on Collins Book Publishers' charter of the KG5 the day before she ran aground in Scarborough in the fog, and those famous pictures of her with the bow right out the water. Well, the two of them appeared at Rothesay together. So just for the sake of tonight, and for those listening online, think that's Rothesay Pier instead of Largs, just for the sense of occasion. Well, John's collection of models had a baby King George, so he went to that to start. But there's a man in his ship having a play in a loch near Crinan with his own handmade pier, and the King George in 2026, believe it, will sail on, albeit in miniature form. By God, she looks good. Even in the trial test tank, along with the miniature fountain, she looks splendid. But she looks good alongside the man-made pier, the fictitious jetty that she never used. Well, we did take her to Oban, and we did get the pictures of the model with the favoured positions, like the Hutchison Monument, the Save the Waverley banner. And believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen listening or here tonight, we took over £700 that day for the Waverley's boiler refit appeal. We went round to the North Pier, and I wanted a picture of the model with McCaig's Tower, deliberately. You can see why I wanted that. And this couple come up and I said, it's King George V. French they were. So I said, how do you respond to the French? Dunkirk, 6 trips. Tenner come out the pocket and put it into the tin. So we do get fun out of the King George at Ship Ahoy and taking it round the streets of wherever. As we did at Oban that day, it made for a happy St Andrew's Day when we come back home with that money to Paul Semple's desk. The Steamer Club and the King George V. Well, there were plenty of times that we enjoyed it. It took a while. The club first looked at 1960 to charter her, and it was knocked back because of cost, and it took until 1970 before it was reopened for the chance. And you'll remember the time that the club chartered her, and it should have been the Queen Mary. We could have sold the King George, 25 of them, it would seem. But we had great fun with the George, and that's her coming into Rothesay on the day I think we all remembered, those of us that were around it, the day she went back to the haunts of her youth, to Ardrishick, and supposedly, but because of the East Gales, she didn't get in, but she carried on to Inverary. We had a good time that day, and there's the club pennant flying proudly coming alongside Rothesay Pier. Now, there's another model maker in Rothesay on the Clyde coast that has King George V to play with. Not working, but equally fine to look at. And there's the George is with some of our contemporaries of the day, the St. Columba and the Diesel Loch Fyne, and you can see the sense of masterpiece these are, recreating in small way the life of these ships that they were to us all. There's Inverary. Now, on board the King George V, there was nothing special, I have to say. This bus-type seating didn't sit comfortably with everybody, but that was the basic standard of Williamson, and it fell here into McBrain at the time. The McBrain did this tour compared to the Lloyd Loom chairs, which still exist in the Waverley to this day. But the mahogany antique woodwork effect that the purser's office and entrance to the dining saloon and all that created was rather special. It offset that. But the bus-type seating was no better than the Keppel. Well, bringing the story to conclusion to pass on to Eric, our final day to Fort William was on the 13th of September 74. The following day was the charter to George Trains, CCA, this Coastal Cruising Association, along with the Scottish Railway Preservation Society, who provided a train to Oban called the Maid of Morven, and it was to take her to Tobermory and Loch Soonart. And that was done in association with the ticket sellers, the Oban and Mull Tourist Association. They had no involvement in the charter fee, it has to be said. The following day, not with lions, but I preferred to watch the George going away without them, was the period of the time when the George was making her last hurrah. Down the Sound of Jura she went. At 12:20 from Oban she sailed down the Sound of Jura, having sailed the Sound of Kerrera. Then she hit thick fog. Radio exchanges with the new Pioneer were done. At 7 o'clock at night, 1900, she rounded the Mull of Kintyre, still in fog. And that night, at just after 11, she dropped the hook in Kilcatton Bay, with George Crawford, the captain, saying he would prefer not to go any further. Now, whether that was because of the fog or something else, I've got no clue. I'll leave you to work your imaginations. Let's say the party time was on. The 17th of September, the following morning, the new car ferry Juno was being manoeuvred to Lamment's dry dock, and the George had to go to Gourock, where she berthed bow west with the Queen Mary II at 8 o'clock in the morning. And I saw the George that morning. I was going on the Mary for the cruise round Bute with Robin Boyd. At 11:30 that morning, she sailed for the East India Harbour, and the final finish with engines. So what we've got now is two models of the George to have fun with. And we've had it out in the Waverley, and the passengers have enjoyed it. John doesn't do anything by half. He even has the blankets with RMS King George V on it. And despite the weather on that particular occasion, yes, the King George did the 6 Lochs cruise, yet again. I would like to record my affection for the King George. I was a small lad in all of this, but I clutched these things like there were no tomorrow. Steamers of the Clyde and Western Isles, volumes 1 and 2. How did Robin Boyd design that cover? Well, he took a black and white photograph, Robin being an architect, took the photograph, traced it, so that it replicated the thing in its, rather than a mock look-alike. You would say that is the King George V, with instant eye effect. It stands out. That's how Robin did it. The rest all fell into place. I said, I wanted the King George to be perfect for what they wanted, the 3 Max. It's a Duff postcard, but it's the first one I ever purchased with my own pocket money. It's horrible in its colour, but it's still in the mint condition. I purchased it at the age of 4 from McDougall's, the stationers at the Columba Hotel in Oban, and I cherish it. She cost £69,648 to build, and in 1960 it was looked at by Robin in research. She had earned 22,500 profit in 1960. Billy, you'll be able to tell us at some later stage how much 22,500 is worth now. I would say not inconsiderable. And she carried that year 66,340 passengers. Now the George wasn't out for as long as the Waverley is now, end of May to the middle of September. But Eric will be covering East India Harbour on more recent occasions than this. That's the Loch Broom with the George, and the Loch Earn with the George. Happier times in the Clyde, of course, were round the corner. And we had, as I said, we had plenty of them. The Waverley in 2026 will be going to Iona. That was one of the New Year resolutions of the Waverley Company not that long ago. And she will call it Tobermory, and she will leave Oban in majestic style as the King George V did until her last in 1974. I've even had a play with the model, and I love doing that, it's great. The King George V came into the world the same year as Stanley Baxter and Her Majesty the Queen, the late, both with a royal connection. For Stanley Baxter did take off the Queen rather well. As I look back in the Oban scene, I'll always think of the King George V, and with affection remember those from this Clyde River Steamer Club who held her equally so. Thank you very much.
Sound check, is that okay?
We can hear you.
Yep. Just remove things a bit. Now, I constructed this slide simply to link our two presentations. A very simplified summary of King George V's career, as you can see. Those red funnels seen in Oban Bay or elsewhere in the West Coast waters or Clyde waters always captured one's attention. In fair weather or foul, marking her out as the outstanding steamer for me, for other enthusiasts, and for the general public in the latter years of her career. Now, I was tasked tonight with giving a pictorial representation of the fifth and final decade of King George V's career, from the pictures I had taken back in the years from 1965 to 1974. So this is not a detailed historical record, but rather a personal look at the turbine in that final decade, focusing on a few particular aspects. First, we will look at King George V during winter layups. Now, having joined this club at the start of this 1963-64 session, with a very limited awareness of the vessels which served the Clyde and West Highland waters, I quickly realised that there was much more to the steamer scene than the occasional doon-the-water trips or crossing to one or other Clyde Islander resorts for summer holidays. A red-funnelled turbine steamer trading in the far distant waters of the West Highlands was something worth investigating. But before my days of car ownership was generally not a day-trip possibility. So spotting King George V during winter lay-ups in the Clyde became for me a keenly observed practice in those years. This is in the 64-65 winter, and in fact it was my first picture that I took of King George V. And though I say it was winter, it was the 3rd of June 1965 because you didn't leave the Clyde that year to the 10th of June to head up to Oban. The following winter, and the turbine found different quarters in the Albert Harbour. Unfortunately, in this shot, somewhat hidden behind a pesky paddler. The 1966-67 winter was a repeat of the Waverley and King George V pairings in Albert Harbour, but this time we include Butte and Talisman berthed on the other side of the harbour entrance. All 4 boats looking quite bright and cheery and not the least hungover, despite being pictured just a couple of days after Hogmanay. The following year, and George's winter quarters were moved upriver to Glasgow, to the Queensdock North Basin. Now, I've got to admit at this point, I made the classic photographer's error with this picture, because as you will see, the spire of Glasgow University is coming out the wheelhouse roof. But let's face it, I think we can get away with that. She was a degree or 2 better than the other boats of the time. The next winter, she was to be found in the south basin of Queensdock when photographed, here along with McBrain's cargo boat Loch Broom. Later that spring, learning that she was due to leave for her summer season at Oban on the 15th of May 1969, I went early that day to the Queensdock and took a series of 12 pictures, of which I show just 4 as she set off for Oban. The first here, leaving from the head of the dock with Loch Carron and Loch Ard at their cargo berths. And then she is about to go through the narrow exit from the dock, and so on out into the River Clyde proper. And finally, heading off downriver, with the Clyde Port Authority ferry number 8 over at the Highland Lane steps, the lane that ran between at the back of the Govan graving dock on one side and the Stevens Basin, fitting out basin, excuse me, on the other. And ahead of the George, of course, we can see in the south bank the Harland and Wolff building with the cranes of Fairfield's shipyard behind that. And also, you can maybe just pick out, just there, the remains of Govan Pier, which was still extant at that time. In 1969-70 winter, She was back into East India Harbour for that winter and succeeding winters thereafter. And she has for company Lochiel, and of course in front of her, Rover and Second Snark. A later visit in the spring of 1970, I found her in Lamet's dry dock for final sprucing up before heading north to Oban for the summer. And as John News talked about last month, if you pick the right day and the right time, you could get down into the floor of the dry dock and get your pictures, no bother, no one chasing us away. In the 70-71 winter, she is seen with Loch Broom and Loch Ard for company. Then King George V, all by itself in 71, 72, and in 72, 73, following transference to Caledonian McBrain ownership, and now fitted with the Calmac lines, which, as you know, came off the Duchess of Hamilton. Otherwise engaged, quite literally, I never managed time for pictures in the 73-74 winter, but round off this section with, in January 75, King George V, after withdrawal, and laid up alongside alongside the similarly withdrawn Claymore. So we now move on our attention to King George V and her summer base at Oban. Here we see her at her traditional overnight railway berth, with alongside the normal working berths Loch Broom and Claymore behind. A Sunday scene, so no McBrain boats operational on Sundays back then. The daily routine of repositioning from the overnight berth to the North Pier to begin the day's excursion was a standard feature in these years. And here, seen returning to the North Pier from an Iona cruise. This would be in the late afternoon. A general shot of her at the North Pier. I included this one principally just to comment on, you'll note, the McBrain offices of the time. Yeah. When you think about it, back then, the George, most days could be handling 400 or 500 passengers on its cruise to Staffa and Iona, or maybe not quite so many when the days she went up to Fort William. Yet that wee office could cope with the selling of tickets and all the rest of it, no bother at all. Nowadays we've got the monstrosity over in the railway pier of the offices, and well, you know the problems sometimes that crop up. A late afternoon evening departure from the North Pier, most likely on an evening return cruise to Fort William on this occasion. And a grandstand viewing point in those days was the view from Pulpit Hill, with King George V here returning from an Iona excursion. Nowadays, of course, that view is more or less lost with all the vegetation and trees having grown so much, and it's now very difficult getting much of a sight of Oban Bay. One or two pictures I've seen from the sea. King George at the railway pier, from on board the Loch Nevis, which was returning from her Wednesday 6 Loch cruise. And another view of George, this time at the North Pier, and viewed from the Loch Toskig, which was the Lismore boat. Even at a more distant sighting, the George was a graceful addition to the scene, and again viewed from Loch Toskig. Tobermory was a notable calling place for King George V and provided a number of interesting viewpoints. Here, the onboard scene after passage up the Sound of Mull as the turbine passes Cav Island and begins her turn into Tobermory Bay. On one of my many visits to Tobermory, I took the opportunity of a low tide on this particular day to climb down the ladder affixed to the harbour wall to get this sea level view. A view from behind the pier on the start of the path to Runagal Lighthouse. And a scene of her going astern out from the pier as viewed from that path. And another shot of her departing Tobermory Bay as the Kilhoan ferry of the time, Loch Nell, was arriving. If staying ashore in Tobermory, the views from Tobermory's old stone quay were almost worth missing out on the cruise to Staffa and Iona. Here we see her at the pier and backing out into the bay, ready to turn. On 17th August 1972, King George V was scheduled to fit in a call on our Staffa and Iona cruise day at Craignure to offload passengers bound for the annual agricultural show at Salon, but had to omit that call due to the windy weather conditions, and so carried on all the passengers, so those that were going to the show as well, to Tobermory. Now, having been to Iona just a couple of days before, I had planned to land at Craignure and spend the day on Columba, shuttling between Oban, Craignure and Lochalan. So landing at Tobermory thus gave me this one more photo opportunity before getting the bus back down to Craignure. That was, as I say, 17th August 1972. Almost exactly a year later, one day less in fact, I was at Tobermory as King George V arrived with a well-laden compliment. And that was no in charter or anything, that was a normal day, if you like, a normal summer's day. Even in what we would be, in what would be her penultimate year of service, as you can see, she was still as popular as ever. We now move on to Iona, the excursion destination with which King George V will always be most closely remembered. Here at anchor at Iona, as seen from one of the ferry boats taking passengers ashore. Having visited Iona Abbey on my first visit to Iona some years earlier, I now preferred seeking out other interesting photo opportunities whenever ashore on subsequent cruises. And I must admit, I love this view of with the beautiful clinker-built Ori boat there, and I must admit, tempted to shove it, roll it back down into the water. The oars were there until I realised that the owner wasn't daft. He'd taken the rowlocks home with him. Passengers, returning passengers, awaiting the ferry they're on the Iain, the jetty, awaiting the ferry to go back out to the King George V. And a general view of returning to King George V for continuation of the circuit of Mull. On days when her capacity was being used to full extent, the ferries operated from both port and starboard ferry doors at the same time. You can just see just there, tail end of one of the ferries pulling away, and we were on one, went round the bow and were circled round to come in as the one on the starboard side left, and we pulled in there. That would be the last ferry of the day, because I usually made a point of making sure I was one of the last ones that left Iain on the way back. And by this time they would have cleared the fendering on the starboard side. I just had the port one to lift in once we set sail. More normally, the cruising would be anti-clockwise round Mull, but on occasions when it ran clockwise, attractive views over the bow could be obtained, such as the Cohoan Hills here on approach to the Sound of Mull, and from on deck sailing down past Runagal Lighthouse. Another frequent destination for the George was the trip from Oban up Loch Linnhe to Fort William, and here we see our steamer loading at the North Pier for the Fort William trip. And if you possibly see there the wee wooden board saying Fort William hung there on the vent, and just to make sure that no one went aboard thinking they were going for a cruise to Iona. I see a view from on board George sailing up Loch Linnhe as we approach Ardgour Lighthouse at the Corran Narrows. And at Fort William Pier. Here we had the excellent transport links with rail and McBrain's bus services immediately to hand. That picture was 1968. A few years later, Highland omnibuses took over the buses when McBrain's withdrew from road transport operations. And that's the Highland omnibus. Buses were painted in a light grey colour. Now I ask you, was there ever anywhere a railway platform that had such a fine view as this? With King George V at the pier, we find the former Rossi-based small excursion boat made of Butte. Then, in 1972, operating as the Camasnagool ferry and offering other short trips. One of the better sunny days that I got up at Fort William. and King George V going astern out from Fort William Pier. For our final topic, we look at a feature we as enthusiasts revelled in from 1970 to 1974, the use of King George V for Clyde-based excursions and its availability for charters or one-off special sailings, all basically stemming from the eventual absorption of the CSP and McBrain's into the Scottish Transport Group and subsequent formation of Caledonian McBrain Limited. The club can be proud to say that we led the way with our Thursday evening charter of the Turbine from Gourock to Wemyss Bay and Loch Ranza on the 14th May 1970. I just had enough time to nip ashore in our when we made our call at Wemyss Bay Pier. And a few well-kent faces or people aboard in that one. And here we are at Loch Ranza Pier. The following day, she made a positioning run to Ayr, here arriving that Friday evening and berthing at the north wall. That was so she was in position for a special charter to the CCA, departing Ayr on the Saturday morning to Bangor in Northern Ireland. After that, having then sailed overnight to Oban, she began a week's charter on the Monday to the Highlands and Islands Development Board, involving unique cruises and visits to piers new to the George. Having just commenced new employment, I was unable to get time off, but thanks to spare slides given to me by Jim Aikman-Smith, I can show a couple of views from that charter. King George V at Kylo Pier on the Tuesday of that week, 19th of May. And King George V in Loch Ewe at Mellon Charles Pier, close to Alt Bay, the original planned pier call that day. And you can see just from the state of the sea, you can gather one of the big problems of that whole week was the weather. And much of the planned route and time and calls were affected. It was a pity for the George, and the idea of publicising West Highland cruising. The following year, King George V again began her summer season in the Clyde, but this time deputising for Queen Mary II, which was undergoing refurbishment. The George visited a variety of Clyde piers, some of which she had last visited in the Williamson Buchanan White Funnel era. Originally, as Iain had mentioned earlier, the 1st May 1971 CRSC charter was to have been operated by Queen Mary II, sailing from Ayr to various Upper Firth piers with some unique calls for the CSP turbine. It became ever more unique when we learned that our steamer for the day would be King George V. Here we see her, with the previous picture, I've jumped a picture maybe there. We see her at, I'll just go back to that one there, at Millport Keppel Pier. And, after that day, yes, we had included some of the, I'm not including all the piers, but that was Blair Moor Pier and Kilcreggan. Quite unusual to see a turbine at these piers at all. Further springtime charters for various organisations followed that in the first week of May then. And here we see her leaving Rossi on the Wednesday. This is in fact a picture that Iain McCrory took, and he gave me a slide of that. I hadn't been able to get time off work for that. At the end of that week, on the Saturday, the 8th of May, she sailed from Prince's Dock in Glasgow on what I think was one of the regular springtime works charters. Sorry, just too heavy on the fingers there. Heading downriver, here we see her passing Queen Mary II, which is berthed at the Barclay Currell dockyard, where she was undergoing refurbishment. The picture is taken from the ground, which is now where Braehead Shopping Centre is. Passing under the almost completed Erskine Bridge, just a few weeks before its official opening, and of course also a few weeks before the ending of the Erskine ferry service. And in the background there you can see the Erskine ferry over at the North Kilpatrick side. Later that afternoon at Largs Pier, and then after she'd cruised south and round the south end of Butte and back through the Kyles, we see she came down past Ribodach Point. That was a fun day for me, trying to be in a position to get as many pictures of the turbine in different locations. The CRSC had a second charter of King George V in 1971, a repeat of the evening cruise idea from the previous year, but this time to Tinnebruch and round Butte. The Thursday evening charter idea continued in 1972, the destination this time being the Loch Fyne port of Tarbert. In 1973, King George V's only Clyde cruise was again a CRSC charter, this time a full day's sailing to Loch Fyne, with scheduled calls at Ardrishig and Inverary. Unfortunately, due to the windy conditions, Ardrishig had to be bypassed. Into her final year of service, and once again we had an opportunity for a Thursday evening charter, a cruise starting from Largs via Dunoon to Gourock and then to Loch Goyle. And this is where I joined at Gourock for the final part of the trip. I finish with these two images from the autumn of 1973. The last couple of seasons of operation were plagued with disruptions, principally due to poor weather conditions, and this badly affected her annual carryings. This was seen in Caledonian McBrain's view as justification for the decision to withdraw King George V at the close of the 1974 summer season, despite the fact that the turbine was, as you can see, in fine fettle and looking as good as she had been over nigh on 50 years of service. This picture is perhaps my favourite image of the the George from in my collection. She looks in magnificent condition as she returns to Oban from an overnight berthing at Craigmuir, that being a result of work involved in the construction of the link span in our time-honoured berth at the railway pier. And of course that was to allow for the introduction of drive-on, drive-off car ferry operations. The second and final picture shows her in Oban Bay. King George V was an outstanding example of British turbine excursion steamer vessels of the era, and the sight of her in Oban Bay was never bettered before her arrival or since her withdrawal. The turbine, quite rightly, is deserving of the accolade King of Oban Bay. Thank you.
Well, gentlemen, I'm sure you agree we've been regally entertained tonight with King George V. Bit disappointed that Eric didn't have a photograph of King George V at Port Oban. It's my one experience of sailing on her, was to have been ejected out of the side of the boat by two McBreen Burleys into the ferry. So would you please join with me and show appreciation again to the two gentlemen for their time tonight and the excellent selection of slides we have witnessed. All that remains is to wish you all a safe journey home and to remind you that the next meeting is 11th of February in here, which will be a members' evening. Hopefully we will be on time with it. We won't have the same technical issues that seem to have plagued us in recent months. So I wish you all a safe journey home and thank you for your attendance. Thank you.
Well done.